Hello and welcome to your next workshop, which is on carbohydrates. And while we're talking about carbohydrates, we will naturally fall into talking about fiber and the glycemic index as well. So, another big one today. Sorry, I'm just going to have a glass of water. Another big topic because there's a lot to talk about carbohydrates, but I have in some of the other workshops covered carbohydrates, especially in terms of energy use and how they're used and why we want to use carbohydrates for energy. Bowie's going to join us. So today, a lot of the talk is on fiber and understanding the glycemic index and what sort of foods carbohydrates are predominantly in. So before you start watching or listening to this, I really recommend you have a look at the downloads, the PDFs, as part of this workshop, because I think it would be really helpful for you to have them to refer to as I talk. Those downloads are, for one, a big table or a chart of foods that are high and foods that are low in the glycemic index, which helps you make healthy choices when it comes to what sort of carbohydrate-rich foods you should be eating and which ones to stay away from. And the other download is a really big one. It's my whole ebook on eating. So it includes one of the downloads that was in the fats workshop, if you've done that, but it also includes the one for protein, if you've done that, or you'll need that for in the future workshop on protein. And it has a lot of information on the carbohydrates topic that I'm talking about today, and a lot of other tips as well. So it's a culmination of a lot of PDFs and small bits of advice I've done put into one ebook specifically for the eat component of Think, Eat, Feel. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just do a really quick recap on our macronutrients, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Remembering that when we're having fats, we're looking for between 20 to 35% fat. The reason there's a minimum 20% is because the vitamins that fats hold in them, we need 20% to get enough vitamins out of those fat vitamins. In terms of protein, 15 to 20% of our total daily intake should be comprised of protein-rich foods, and 45 to 65% of our total food intaken per day should be carbohydrate-rich foods. So that's today. Carbohydrates come predominantly from plant-based foods, and carbohydrates are basically a series of molecules all joining together to create different types of carbohydrates or different types of sugars, you could say. So we have simple sugars and then complex carbohydrates, okay, or simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. And so the more complex they become, the more different types of compounds are built in to that one specific type of carbohydrate. I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of what I'm about to talk about now. So it is a blanket name for a series of different types of chemically diverse compounds, carbohydrates. And basically, if you think about it, every plant that is different to the other will have a different molecular makeup, and that's what we're talking about. Okay, so the more complex the plant, the more molecules that form that carbohydrate, the longer it takes to be processed in our body, okay? So the simpler the compound, the more simple the type of plant that we're eating or the type of food that we're eating, for instance, the more refined the food might be, or something that doesn't have a lot of different sorts of cells in its makeup, the quicker it is to break down in our body, digest, and extract energy from, okay? So if we're talking about simple carbohydrates, we're talking about things such as honey, table sugar, um, fruits like grapes and things like that that they might have a high water content, the fruit, and then all there really is one or two very simple sugar compounds within it. Okay, and it's important to know that there's a big difference between sports nutrition and just nutrition for overall health, because sports nutrition, we're trying to get as much energy into the body as quickly as possible because we're burning off and using so much muscular force that we need to meet that demand that the body's asking. But in overall health, we don't necessarily need these quick releasing energy sources, okay? But we do need lots of vitamins, antioxidants, minerals, and things like that. Okay, so some examples of compounds that you might see on food labeling, or just talked about in general for simple carbohydrates are glucose, fructose, lactose, sucrose, maltose, sugar alcohols, sorbitol, maltitol, and there's a couple of others. So those types of compounds, if you ever hear of them, they're very quick releasing. So they basically come in, we eat them, they go into our small intestine, and they're converted at that point into glucose generally and go into our bloodstream. Okay, so it's quite a quick process of conversion. So yeah, that's in the small intestine. Complex carbohydrates are more foods that also have starch and cellulose in them. Okay, so more of your vegetable type foods. Okay, so things that might have a thicker plant cell wall around them, they're more fibrous, and they might take a little bit longer. They might be something that you have to cook in order to eat, or take a bit longer to break down or to chew, and things like that. So examples of complex carbohydrates are well, what I've just said, so vegetables and fruits or plants that have thicker cell walls on them. And within those complex carbohydrates, where you have starch and cellulose, there's two types of starch. There's resistant starch, and then there's just starch, known as starch. So an example of just starch would be potatoes that have been cooked, and lentils or beans that have been soaked, okay, and then cooked. Resistant starch is maybe those potatoes that have now cooled back down, okay, in a potato salad. Sorry, I'm just going to have a drink of water. Or beans and legumes that haven't been soaked or not cooked, okay, so very difficult for the body to extract and break down the cell wall. So when they are complex, they're not actually broken down. When they're starchy or have cellulose in them, so these complex carbohydrates, they're not broken down in the small intestine and put in the bloodstream as simple sugar or glucose, we'll call it. So when they're not digested that way, what happens is that they actually go into the large intestine and they're fermented by our healthy bacteria in the large intestine, and they become, part of them become actually short chain fatty acids that are absorbed into the bloodstream and used by the liver or our muscle cells. Okay, they're also transferred into the colon to help the cells of the colon to grow. So that's part of what they do. And then also this cellulose, this fibrousy parts of the carbohydrates of these plants we call fiber. So in terms of fiber, that does a whole other thing for us as well, which I'm going to go into. So from this point on, I just want you to remember that there's simple carbohydrates broken down quickly in the small intestine and used up as glucose floating in our bloodstream as energy. And then there is complex carbohydrates, which do a lot more than just provide us with an energy fuel. There's also foods, carbohydrate foods, that are in between those two. So they provide us with glucose for energy, but then they also provide us with all those other things. Okay? So the more natural the plant food is, the less processed and untouched it is, the more it will be a complex carbohydrate. And some examples in real foods would be things like fruits that are very ripe, milk and honey. They have large amounts of simple carbohydrates in them to give us energy and little to no starch or cellulose, okay? Whereas if you had, say that was a soft banana, but then if you had an unripened firm banana, that would have a higher amount of starch in it. So its percentage of simple carbohydrates versus complex would become more 50-50, whereas the really ripe banana that's soft is more of a simple carbohydrate, okay? Okay, so quickly in terms of fiber, so we're going to go into that now. So complex carbohydrate type foods have large amounts of fiber in them usually. We want to aim to have 30 grams of fiber per day, and that is the recommended for Australians. And the reason is because fiber has been shown to reduce several risk factors in lifestyle diseases, okay? And in some cancers such as bowel cancer. So let's talk about fiber. The edible parts of plants that are resistant to digestion and absorption in our small intestine, these are the ones that have complete or partial fermentation in the large intestine, which allows growth of healthy microorganisms in that large intestine, okay? So fiber has a laxation effect. It lowers our cholesterol and also can lower our blood glucose levels. The reason it has that laxation effect is that we have soluble and insoluble fiber. So the insoluble fiber is that hard cell wall that even when we chew it, it doesn't get broken down into anything else into our body, okay? It stays as it is. So if you have whole wheat or whole oat grains or even brown rice, the outside wall, even when we intake it, or even the outside of seeds, when we ingest seeds, that harder, firmer cell wall on the outside, that goes through us. We don't absorb it and break it down anymore. And there's really good things about that insoluble fiber because it comes down through our digestive tract and it can grab on and help clear out things that are sitting on the inside walls of our digestion and clear it out so it doesn't stay and grow within our system if it shouldn't be. The insoluble fiber is a lot softer and it helps with that fermentation process of feeding our good bacteria in our digestive system. And let's talk about what else it does because it does a few things. So it also helps with adequate water to soften our stools. And when we have soft stools, we go to the toilet regularly and that helps, it helps a lot with also detoxifying the body and making sure that that regular movement of stools, that regular bowel movement, actually helps to remove and keep removing carcinogens that might be within our bowels as well. Okay, so how does it lower our cholesterol? So fiber forms complexes and binds to cholesterol within our body, causing the cholesterol to be extracted with the fiber instead of being reuptaken with fats into our digestive tract from the small intestine. So if you don't have enough fiber in your diet, cholesterol will be reuptaken in the small intestine and not moved out. So you could be having cholesterol come in to your body from food, and then the stuff that's already in there that should probably be moving out of our body by then stays there as well, and that's an increase in cholesterol. Okay, so specifically oat bran and pectin is the sort of fiber that helps to do that, not like wheat bran or wholemeal wheat. Okay, it's oat bran and pectin that helps to lower the cholesterol. That's why people are told to have porridge or oats in the morning if their cholesterol might be getting high. So the other reason that fiber is recommended is because it's been shown that adequate fiber, people that have adequate fiber, have a lower risk of coronary artery disease. And the reason is because most complex carbohydrates have a very high amount of vitamins in them. Vitamins like B vitamins, magnesium, and a host of other things which we've gone over in the vitamin workshop. So you can go back and check that. But there's a lot of things we need from our complex carbohydrates that help our heart to be healthier. Okay? So if our fiber isn't adequate, we're at risk of coronary artery disease. In terms of diabetes and complex carbohydrates are important because when we are breaking down our carbohydrates and we have those simple sugars released into glucose in our blood, our pancreas has to release insulin in order to deliver that glucose that's in our bloodstream to what is requiring it. So to our eye muscles to blink, or to our feet to work, things like that, my hands to squeeze. That's relying on glucose floating through my bloodstream. And for that to be passed to that muscle, insulin is required. It's basically the taxi. So our pancreas releases that and produces it. If we have an overload of simple sugars or refined foods where there's not much fiber and complex carbohydrates involved, we have a large amount of blood glucose pumping in our system, okay? And our pancreas has to work overtime to keep producing the insulin till eventually it just gets tired, like a motor in a car, and shuts down. And then we have this overproduction of glucose in the bloodstream without it being able to be transported to anywhere. So having complex carbohydrates instead of simple carbohydrates or refined foods that don't have much fiber, or if we want to call it cellulose or starch, means it's a lot quicker for our body to gain glucose in our bloodstream. But if we have complex carbohydrates, they're not predominantly sugar-based, and so all of those other plant cell walls and harder things that we have to break down take time. So it's a slower process to actually extract the simple sugars that are in that food as well. So it takes longer, and then it gives our pancreas time to slowly produce insulin and for the insulin to do its job instead of being needed a heap of it all at once all the time. So the more complex carbohydrates you eat, the lower your risk of getting type 2 diabetes is, okay? Or you could just say, don't eat simple sugars and refined carbohydrates. In terms of bowel cancer, I'll just cover that a little bit more specifically now. So, bowel cancer and diseases of the bowel, anything carcinogenic that's in the colon is rapidly removed by bulky, soft stools with a high fiber and water diet. The good bacteria in the colon is fed by carbohydrates. So, this bacteria produces gases and something called butyric acid, amongst other acids, but specifically butyric acid is important because it seems to be that acid that inhibits cancer cells from growing, whilst also increasing the growth of healthy cells in the bowel and the colon, in those parts of our digestive system, okay? So that's why fiber is so important. Now, I'm going to talk about the glycemic index. So you have high GI and low GI. And what that means is when we look at a food, if we look at, for instance, a piece of bread, we're comparing that piece of bread to how quickly it breaks down and releases sugar in our system compared to white table sugar. So the glycemic index is based on table sugar being the number one food, the fastest food to break down to glucose into our system. So if you had nothing in your system, you were completely wrecked and you had to get up and run across the road quickly and you literally couldn't move because you were so deficient in any fuel in your body, having table sugar would be the most effective thing to take straight away to get you to stand up, okay? So every other carbohydrate food is compared to table sugar in terms of how quickly it turns to sugar in our body. So the higher the GI of food, generally the less healthy it's going to be because it's going to be predominantly sugar compared to a very low GI carbohydrate food, which means it'll be much higher in vitamins, fiber, all those other things we talked about, and it will take longer to release energy into your body, okay? So I have listed in one of your PDFs the glycemic index different foods, so you can see a really good test is, I remember at uni we did this, if you put a piece of white bread on your tongue, just a piece of it, not the crust, just the white bread, within 2 minutes it will break down and your body will have dissolved it and it will turn to glucose within your bloodstream, okay? If you did that with a piece of rye bread, or sourdough, it will take much, much longer, probably around 20 to 30 minutes, okay? So that's an example. If you had chewed an apple, so the whole apple with the skin, not cut up or anything, you just chewed that, as opposed to having the apple juice. The apple juice, that chewing the apple will take 10 times longer to break down its natural sugar and turn to glucose in your bloodstream, because it's also got to break down the fiber and the cell wall of the skin and all those other things. So apple juice is 10 times quicker to get the energy out of the apple juice, but unfortunately you're not getting any of the other good parts of that apple that we also need for the reasons I just explained. So I really recommend to look at the PDF downloads, especially for that glycemic index chart, because it really gives you an idea if you're trying to maintain or, for instance, lose a bit of weight and you're not able to do lots of exercise. Having low GI foods, the lower the GI, the longer it takes to break down in your system and the less energy you're getting constantly released, and you might not be able to use all that energy up, so then it's just going to get stored on you, okay? But also if you're trying to increase a lot of your vitamins, which if you look at your vitamin list from the vitamin workshop, you'll see that a lot of complex carbohydrates fulfill a lot of our vitamin needs, especially B vitamins. So have a look and see, the lower the GI of a carbohydrate food, usually the higher the vitamin intake that's in it, especially for B vitamins. Okay. All right. So another one that I want to briefly touch on is the word pectins. So you may have heard of pectins before. Pectins are compounds that are found in the cell walls of plant materials, and less than 1% of plants are made up of pectins, but they are there, okay? The very, very thin sort of brushing of the outside of plants, okay? So what happens is they form insoluble salts from the phosphates that make them up, which actually prevents the absorption of iron, calcium, and zinc in your intestine. So if you're eating plant foods, it's important that we prepare them in a way that the pectins are broken down or removed off the food for our digestion. Or the other interesting thing is that people that were on a high consumption of, whole grain, cereals, legumes, beans, all of that, but with very little meat intake, showed that they had zinc and iron deficiencies, because we can get zinc and iron from red meat very easily, and zinc from other animal products as well. But if the person was having a predominantly plant-based diet with only small amounts of meat, a couple of times a week, they were often still deficient because the amount of pectins they were having was limiting their absorption of iron and zinc and calcium. So basically what we need to do with our plant foods, especially when we're eating whole foods, it's coming straight from the ground or not refined in any way, which we want, we just need to make sure that in terms of nuts and legumes, we want to soak them and or cook them at 70-degree temperatures up to break down these pectin compounds. Having liquids, over your cereal, so sometimes people are just eating, their muesli from the box as a snack, but, pouring that milk and softening and moving all the pectins off the outer cell wall of those whole oats or whole grain wheat products will also help to remove the pectins. And obviously cooking rice, which we have to anyway, removes them. Heating wheat-based products to help. Phytates, I'm saying, sorry, not pectins, phytates, all right? So just everything I've said about pectins then, just change it to the word phytates, okay? So washing the outside of your apple skin or fruits that you're eating with skin on them, good, keep eating the skin, but you need to just wash them first to remove the phytates off that, okay? So yes, phytates, not pectins, is what I was talking about then. Okay. Pectin is a type of simple sugar that we get in fruit and some other things. So let's just recap. Let's just look at everything that I've just talked about and remember that dietary fiber and whole grains together are needed because the whole grains provide the vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. And the fiber within that food allows the growth of healthy bacteria and the removal of carcinogenic substances in our body, okay? So complex whole plant foods are the way to go as opposed to refined carbohydrates, that are manufactured and instead of having, the juice of that apple, have the whole apple. Okay, just make sure you wash off the phytates on the outside. If you're having raw nuts, straight from the tree, you've just broken open the shell, that's great. But maybe just slightly, roast them a little bit or pan fry them put them on a salad or soak them overnight, okay? That's a great way to get the phytates off nuts that are, great for you and not sprayed, but you still want to just make sure you remove those phytates to get the most that you can out of the vitamins and minerals involved in that food. So recapping, remembering that 30 grams of fiber in your diet, reduces your risk of coronary artery disease, diabetes, high cholesterol, bowel cancer, diverticulitis, bowel issues, things like that. It's important also to remember that we want to eat a variety of different plants and grains because they all have different amounts of vitamins and minerals and different amounts of fiber and natural sugars within them. And not to worry too much about carbs being bad and too much energy, and carbs putting weight on for us. If we're having the right sort of carbohydrates, it's actually great for us and really healthy and packed with vitamins and minerals. You'll see in the PDF downloads I've actually given you serving sizes of how much to have, and it's usually up to 5 serves of half a cup of complex carbohydrates, and I've given heaps of examples there of what that looks like. So you would break that up throughout the day, because there's one more thing that's called glycemic load. So you can eat a low glycemic meal. For instance, brown rice breaks down slower than white rice does. Brown rice and basmati rice have a much lower GI than just white rice. So over time, say over about 2 to 3 hours, that brown or basmati rice is slowly breaking down in partly the small intestine, mostly in the large intestine. And so we're not getting a high insulin release or blood glucose level, okay? However, you can have high glycemic load, which means you're eating that brown rice, but if you're eating too much of the brown rice in that one sitting, you're still going to have an excess of circulating blood glucose, because even though it's going to take 3 hours to break it down, if you're having more than that half a cup serve, you're still going to have an excess of blood glucose at the end of that you won't be able to use up. So especially at night time, we often want to sit down and have a big meal of pasta, or a big curry with some nice rice and things like that. But we need to think about what muscle usage are we going to do after that meal to use up the circulating blood glucose that it is releasing. So even though brown rice or sourdough or rye bread has a lower amount of sugar in it that converts to glucose in our bloodstream, it still has it. So if you're not going to use that energy afterwards, it will just get stored as excess energy, and then you're going to have to make up the burning of that the next day if you're trying to maintain or lose weight. If you're trying to put on weight, then definitely go for your life and eat a larger load of complex carbohydrates at night, because that will put on weight essentially. So I hope that makes sense in terms of glycemic load, high glycemic index foods, low glycemic index foods. Even if you're eating the healthier one, you still can't eat too much of it unless you're going to burn all of that off after that sitting, okay? Again, if you've got any questions on this, I'm expecting lots of questions on this. It's quite a big, complex topic, carbohydrates, but I think it's one that can be understood, when you might want to listen to this once or twice, and also refer to the PDFs I've given, because once you do get your head around high GI, low GI, and understand that different foods have different types of carbohydrates in it, it really helps you to make better decisions on what sort of carbohydrate foods you're going to eat. Okay? So thanks for listening, guys, and I hope you've learned a lot from this one and we can talk about it in your private sessions as well. Bye.